and the presence of IgM observed in rodents are related to signs of dementia in humans. The magnitude of the changes was large and consistent among the studies. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And CDC agrees with the NRC that this is a correct summary of the hazard.
Correct.
So I hope that was able to play okay through this Zoom, but there you can see that CDC's director of its Division of Oral Health, did not contest or dispute the validity of the NRC's findings that fluoride damages the brain in animals. And as we'll talk about later, by the time this case was over, there was no dispute that fluoride is a neurotoxicant, that at some exposure level, it will damage the brain. And, I thought it was notable that this, even the CDC, which, aggressively promotes fluoridation, conceded that, at least in animal studies for the CDC. Now, another person that I deposed in this case was Dr. Christina Thayer, and she is the director of EPA's Chemical and Pollutant Assessment Division. Dr. Thayer has studied fluoride neurotoxicity back when she was working for the National Toxicology Program. And I asked her about the animal studies on fluoride neurotoxicity, and she agreed that the animal data supports the biological plausibility of fluoride causing neurotoxic effects in humans. And, this is, maybe obvious, but it's worth pointing out that we don't conduct laboratory experiments on rats in order to understand how rats in the environment are affected by environmental chemicals. We study rats in the laboratory to understand how chemicals may affect our health, human health. And there is a very troubling body of research showing that fluoride damages the brain in animals in the laboratory. And again, by the time this case was over, there was no dispute that fluoride is a neurotoxic compound. So one of the questions I asked in discovery was, what is the dose of fluoride that is safe, that won't cause concern for potential effects on the brain? The corollary of that is, what is the level that we start to see adverse effects? Like, when does it go from safe to toxic? What dose of exposure can we be comfortable ingesting? And how does that dose vary based on an individual's own unique susceptibilities? So to help answer this question, I went to various different corporations and institutions in this country. Here, you'll see that I serve subpoenas on the 3 largest sellers of the chemicals that we fluoridate water with in the United States: Mosaic, Solvay, and Simplot. And the chemical that we use for most water fluoridation programs is a chemical called hydrofluorosilicic acid. And it's a very corrosive chemical that is captured in air pollution control equipment, believe it or not, in the commercial fertilizer industry. And I asked these companies if they had any data on the safe dose of fluoride that we can be confident will not harm the brain. And they all came back with the same response. And as you can see here, this is the letter from Solvay saying that Solvay has not taken any actions to determine the daily dose of fluoride ion that will not cause neurotoxic effects. So Solvay said, we don't have the answer to that question. You're going to have to look somewhere else. And that was the same with the other companies selling these chemicals. So I also went to the FDA. The FDA, as you all know, is the agency that regulates the drugs that are sold in this country. Now, water fluoridation is a unique practice because it is a practice whereby we are adding a medicine to the water. Because fluoride is defined as a medicine when it is used for the prevention of disease. We add fluoride to drinking water to prevent tooth decay or caries, which is a disease. And so water fluoridation is a form of medication. But the FDA does not regulate water fluoridation, although it does regulate other fluoride products like toothpaste. So I asked the FDA if it had any data on the safe dose of fluoride with respect to the brain, and if the FDA had any position as to what that safe dose is. And as you can see here in the last sentence, the FDA stated it has no position on this topic. So the FDA did not come back to me to say, yes, we know the safe dose. We're confident that, X dose is safe. You don't have to worry. Instead, the FDA came back and said, we don't know the answer to that question. We haven't looked at it. So I went elsewhere to see if someone else might have that information. And here, this is a clip of a deposition I took of the representative of the NSF International Organization. NSF is an organization that certifies the chemicals that are added to drinking water in the US. EPA delegated that task to NSF, I believe, back in the 1980s. And so there are states in the United States where a community is required to get certification by NSF before they add a chemical to the drinking water. So NSF certification is considered to be important as some measure of the safety of a chemical. So here I asked NSF if they have any data on the safety of water fluoridation with respect to neurotoxicity. And here's some of what the representative said.
Ask you, has NSF taken any steps to determine the potential for fluoridation chemicals to cause neurotoxic effects?
No.
Does NSF have any position on whether fluoridation chemicals can cause neurotoxic effects?
Since we have not conducted our own risk assessment on the fluoridation chemicals, we do not have a position on whether they are able to cause neurotoxic effects.
Okay.
So you can see there, the NSF, it also has not done anything to look into this issue and did not have any position on whether water fluoridation could pose risks of neurotoxic effects. So here is the CDC again. Remember, this is Casey Hannon, the director of the Division of Oral Health. And at his deposition, I asked for CDC's position on the upper tolerable intake of fluoride exposure with respect to the brain. And upper tolerable intake is another way of saying basically the safe level. What is the level that we can receive without being concerned about impacts on the brain? And here is what Mr. Hannon said.
So based on CDC's response to topic 10 and 11, it's correct to say that CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects for infants.
Yes.
Okay. And you see how the definition also includes toddlers.
Mm-hmm.
So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on toddlers.
That's true.
Okay. And you see how the definition also includes children?
Yes.
So CDC does not have any data on the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children.
Right. As stated in our response to the issue on 10 and 11, we don't conduct research ourselves related to tolerable upper fluoride intake. Again, that's under the jurisdiction of EPA's drinking water, and they set maximum and minimum containment levels about notifying people when levels are exceeded.
Okay. And CDC, as you sit here today, is not aware of any data in the published literature that would define the tolerable upper fluoride intake for neurotoxic effects on children, for children.
As a rep of CDC, to my knowledge, we don't have any knowledge about that.
Okay.
So there you see, when I went to the CDC and I asked the CDC, you know, what is CDC's position as to the safe level, has how much fluoride we can consume without having an effect on the brain? They didn't know. It's not something that they have looked into. But you can see there in that clip, what the CDC did do is say, you know, that's not something that we look at, but we believe the EPA looks at that. And so that was something that was, you know, I was happy to hear that, or because at the end of the day, the EPA is the defendant in this case. So we had plenty of opportunity to ask the EPA for its position on the safe level of exposure, safe level of fluoride, or what the EPA's position is with respect to that. And again, the EPA gave pretty much the same answer as the CDC. As you can see here, EPA states, we have not undertaken a systematic analysis to determine whether such a tolerable upper fluoride intake for infants is identifiable. So the EPA, as with CDC, admitted they've never undertook this to determine this analysis, and they don't know. They don't know what that safe level of fluoride exposure is for the brain. And I also asked EPA like a lot of other questions that sort of get to the same point, you know, including, you know, asking about the known levels of fluoride that are circulating in the body of people living in fluoridated areas, and asking them if they had any data to show that those levels are safe for the brain. And EPA's position was, no, we don't have information on that. For example, we know that many pregnant women in fluoridated communities have more than 1 part per million fluoride in their urine, which is a measure of total fluoride exposure. And EPA's position was, no, we don't have any data on that. We couldn't say one way or the other whether there is you know, risks with a woman having that level of fluoride in her body. So as you can see, no one had safety data, or certainly no one had competent safety data to provide any assurance that the fluoride exposures we're getting from water fluoridation are safe for the brain. So I want to turn now and talk about something that I think very few people understand and appreciate. And I think it's a really important piece to understanding how we are where we are with water fluoridation, and the basis that the EPA has used to say that this is a safe practice. Because I think you will see with what we're about to look at that the safety standards for fluoride in the US are incredibly crude, just incredibly crude. I think you're going to be surprised that this is what the government has been basing assurances of safety on in the past. And so let's look at some of this. This picture you see on the screen is of 2 men that have a disease called crippling skeletal fluorosis. Crippling skeletal fluorosis is a disease caused by one and only one thing, and that is fluoride, too much fluoride exposure over time. This is a very devastating condition. As you can see here, crippling fluorosis produces, among other things, crippling deformities of the spine and major joints, muscle wasting, neurologic defects, and compression of the spinal cord. If you have crippling skeletal fluorosis, you're in very serious trouble. Now, what's remarkable is the EPA based its safe drinking water level for fluoride, which is set at 4 parts per million, it based its standard on crippling skeletal fluorosis. And specifically, EPA's premise was that crippling fluorosis is the critical effect of fluoride exposure. And in this clip, which you'll see now, this is Edward Ohanian, the representative of the EPA in this litigation. He explains what the critical effect means. What does critical effect mean? So I'm going to play this clip.
And critical adverse effect means the effect of a substance that occurs at the lowest dose, right?
Correct.
Okay. So according to EPA, the first adverse effect that can occur to the human organism from fluoride exposure is crippling skeletal fluorosis.
Correct.
Okay.
Just to repeat what he just admitted to there. The premise of EPA's safety standard for fluoride is that the first adverse effect that fluoride can have on the human organism is a crippling disease called crippling skeletal fluorosis. In other words, until you are crippled, EPA does not consider fluoride to have any effect on the body. If you're not crippled, no adverse effect from fluoride exposure. And for anyone out there who's familiar with the scientific literature on fluoride, that premise is effectively absurd. And yet it was the premise of EPA's safe drinking water standards. Now, crippling skeletal fluorosis is the final stage of this condition called skeletal fluorosis. Again, skeletal fluorosis is a bone disease caused by too much fluoride exposure, and it comes in various stages of severity. Crippling skeletal fluorosis is called stage 3, the final, most advanced form. But the earlier forms of skeletal fluorosis, as you might imagine, are also things that no human would actually want to endure. And so here I'm going to start talking about what does some of the earlier phases of skeletal fluorosis look like. And before doing so, you can see here, and just to confirm, that EPA's safe drinking water standard does not protect against these earlier stages. I asked the representative. So EPA's MCLG, which is the safe drinking water standard. So EPA's safe drinking water standard was designed to prevent the phase 3 crippling skeletal fluorosis, right? Answer, correct. But not to prevent clinical phase 2, right? Correct. So EPA admits that its standard is not designed to protect against these earlier stages of skeletal fluorosis. And here is a clip where the EPA representative talks about what some of these earlier phases of skeletal fluorosis can do.
EPA has defined stage 2 skeletal fluorosis as characterized by sporadic pain, stiffness of the joints, and osteosclerosis of the pelvis and spine, calcification of the ligaments, and at times osteoporosis of the long bones, correct?
Correct.
And as we discussed earlier, EPA did not consider stage 2 skeletal fluorosis to be an adverse health effect when it established the MCLG in 1985, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So stage 2 skeletal fluorosis, which EPA did not consider to be an adverse effect on human health, produces joint pain, joint stiffness, calcification of the ligaments, osteosclerosis, which is a hardening of the bones that has a tendency to cause brittle bone, and osteoporosis in the long bones. None of those conditions EPA found to be adverse to human health. And that, again, is one of the premises of EPA's safe drinking water standard for fluoride. So here is a condition called severe dental fluorosis. As with skeletal fluorosis, dental fluorosis comes in various stages of severity. This is the most advanced form. Fluoride causes this condition by interfering with the mineralization of the enamel. This is a mineralization defect, and it's marked by a increase in porosity of the enamel, sort of like how osteoporosis is a porous bone. Severe dental fluorosis is a situation where the teeth has increased porosity. And as a result, the teeth can chip and flake away. The enamel can chip and flake away, and you see these disfiguring brown and black stains on the enamel. Well, EPA, in its safe drinking water standard, considered this to not be an adverse health effect. This image that you're looking at right here, this condition, EPA found to be not adverse to human health, despite knowing that children with this condition are going to suffer psychological harm or at risk of psychological harm due to the embarrassment of having teeth that look like that, as well as knowing that the teeth can crumble. Now here is Paul Price, someone I deposed in this case. He was working at EPA in the 1980s and was the scientist at EPA who actually wrote the Safe Drinking Water Standard, or in his words, he was the typist. But he was the one who put this Federal Register document together, which explained to the public why EPA found 4 parts per million in water to be safe. And in this clip, but what Paul Price also did is he wrote a mock press release at right around the time that he wrote the safety standard that was published in the Federal Register. He also wrote a mock press release that he circulated to other colleagues at the EPA. And in that mock press release, which the public did not receive a copy of, he really eviscerated EPA's safety standard and just showed how absurd it is. And in this clip, I asked Mr. Price or Dr. Price about one of the things that he said in this mock press release.
Going back to the press release or the mock press release that you wrote, the last sentence of it reads, EPA selected this level based upon a cost-effectiveness study which showed that it is cheaper for people to keep their mouths shut than to remove the fluoride. That's what you wrote, right?
That's correct.
And what did you mean by it's cheaper for people to keep their mouths shut than to remove the fluoride?
I meant to be funny.
And, I understand Dr. Price explained in his deposition that, he was using some dark gallows humor, and that there's a sort of venting that he was doing. But, at the end of the day, the standard was not something that would have been funny for anyone impacted by it, including children who developed this condition of severe dental fluorosis. Now, in the 1980s, there were scientists at the EPA who were very deeply concerned about that so-called safety standard for fluoride, including the union that represents the scientists and professionals at the agency. And they had so much concern about the standard that they tried to join a lawsuit filed by an environmental organization against the EPA. So, in other words, they were trying to join the environmentalists who were suing their own bosses over fluoride, which has never happened before or since, and just shows the seriousness of their concerns. This here is Dr. Robert Carton, who is the president of the union, and I asked him why EPA did that. You want to support the NRDC in its challenge of the EPA's regulation.
Right.
Form leading.
Which we didn't want to do. We made many attempts, as before we've shown here, of trying to get the attention of the powers that be and work it out. and they had no interest in it. So that it forced us into finding another avenue, because this is serious business. You're talking about harming the health of lots and lots of people, and making false statements about what actually is a health effect and what isn't a health effect.
So as Dr. Carton explained, the union tried to work it out internally with the administration, but they weren't getting any response. And so they felt they had no choice but to join this suit from, it was the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, which filed the suit. Unfortunately, the court did not allow the union to join the case, but they tried to. I want to fast forward a bit and talk again about a report that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, which is the National Research Council report from 2016. This report, which took 3 years to complete, the NRC looked at the adequacy of EPA's safety standard and concluded, not surprisingly, but concluded that this standard is too high, it's unsafe, and it needs to be lowered. The NRC concluded that crippling skeletal fluorosis is not an adequate endpoint to base a safety standard on, that you need to protect against the earlier skeletal effects. The NRC also concluded that severe dental fluorosis is an adverse health effect, contrary to what EPA had said, and should be regulated against. Now, this was in 2006, and I should say that the 4 ppm standard is still in effect today. That is still the safe drinking water level of fluoride today in 2025, some 19 years after NRC's conclusions here in 2006. But one thing that EPA did do following the NRC's report is they did a sort of risk assessment of sorts. It was a dose response analysis where EPA devised a new reference dose for fluoride. And a reference dose in sort of lay terms is a safe dose. It's the level at which EPA does not consider there to be any appreciable risk to human health. And in this analysis, EPA selected severe dental fluorosis as the endpoint, the critical effect. So we have a little bit of progress here. The EPA used to consider crippling skeletal fluorosis to be the critical effect. And now, post-NRC, EPA has now agreed to use severe dental fluorosis as the critical effect. And based on that, EPA came up with a reference dose, and this is a little wonky, but 0.08 milligrams of fluoride per kilogram per day. That's the dose, 0.08. Now, in that report, in this assessment from 2010, EPA said that if you prevent severe dental fluorosis, okay, you don't have to worry about any of the other effects that fluoride can cause to human health. This is the most sensitive endpoint. So you protect against severe fluorosis and you're good. Don't have to worry about any other endpoint, any other effects, okay? Now, notably, in our court case, EPA admitted that, well, if we're looking to determine whether adding fluoridation chemicals to drinking water presents a risk to the brain, then EPA would not rely upon that 2010 reference dose for severe fluorosis. So, you know, although EPA said previously this dose will protect against all other effects, when we got to court and we pushed EPA, they admitted, yeah, our reference dose is not relevant to the neurotoxicity effect. There was also something else very significant about what we learned here. Because in this report from EPA in 2010, the EPA said, quote, The standard toxicity database for fluoride is complete, negating the need for a database uncertainty factor. I apologize. I know that's a little wonky, okay? I'm assuming probably many of you are wondering what is a database uncertainty factor, okay? Well, I'll explain. The database uncertainty factor is something that EPA uses where it's something that you could take the safe dose and you can lower it a little bit. You take the reference dose and you lower it a little bit. And it applies where you are, you have good data on, say, in this case, severe dental fluorosis. EPA had good dose response data. Okay, so it sets the reference dose on severe dental fluorosis. But if you have reason to think that there's other health effects, like effects on the brain, okay, for which you don't have great dose response data, but you have concern may actually be real and you need to sort of protect against, then you can use a margin. It's called a margin of safety or an uncertainty factor, where you lower that reference dose down so as to protect against the potential for these other effects, okay? Now here in the 2010, EPA said, no, we don't need to have a database uncertainty factor because the standard toxicity database for fluoride is complete, meaning we have so many studies on fluoride, there's no need to have this factor because, we're confident that there's no other concerns at play, no other health effects of concern. That's what EPA said in writing in this report. I remember when I first read it, I thought that's just absurd. I mean, it's just anyone familiar with the literature at that time knew that it was major red flags. But nevertheless, that was EPA's official position. But in this case, the representative of EPA admitted the real reason why EPA did not use a database uncertainty factor. He said, and I'll read the clip right here. He said that, I said, you made it clear that EPA can't apply uncertainty factors because they will put the reference dose below the so-called optimal dose for fluoride ingestion, right? Correct. What he was saying is we couldn't use a database uncertainty factor because if we did, the safe dose would be so low, it would be lower than the amount that we give to kids to prevent cavities, the so-called optimal dose, which is 0.05 milligrams per kilogram per day. So he was saying we couldn't do an uncertainty factor. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't because it would take you below the optimal dose. Well, first off, they should have said that in the 2010 report, but they never did, okay? The second thing is he admitted in his deposition that the data that was available as of 2010 was sufficient to implement a database uncertainty factor for developmental neurotoxicity, impacts on the brain. Here's a clip from the deposition. So would apply some database uncertainty factor to account for that potential developmental neurotoxicity, correct? Answer, yes. So this highlights something that became a recurring theme in our litigation, and that is that EPA has consistently failed to use its risk assessment procedures for fluoride, because it knows that if it approaches fluoride like it approaches other toxic compounds, the safe dose is going to be far lower than the dose that hundreds of millions of Americans are ingesting every day under the premise that it's good for our teeth. So EPA has sort of been handcuffed in being able to use its normal procedures that it uses to protect us from all other toxic chemicals. It has not used them for fluoride. And we'll see that come up again in my presentation later on in the litigation. So given EPA's position that we can't use, these safety factors for fluoride because we need to be able to swallow fluoride for tooth decay, one of the things I explored in the litigation was, is fluoride ingestion actually beneficial for teeth? And to help address that, I actually went and met with Dr. Ole Feierskov from Denmark, who's one of the world's leading experts on how fluoride affects the teeth. He's written this textbook here, Dental Caries, which is a leading textbook in the field. And Dr. Feierskov wrote an expert report for us in this case where he stated, quote, the only proven effect of ingesting fluoride during the long-lasting process of tooth development is to develop dental fluorosis, which is the early signs of a toxic biologic effect of fluoride. So as Dr. Feierskov made clear, the benefit of fluoride for teeth does not require any ingestion at all. The beneficial effect requires the topical contact with the outside of the tooth. So it's a topical effect, not a systemic effect. And that's a very significant sort of development in the science that's occurred over the past 30 or 40 years, because we used to believe, the public health community used to believe that fluoride's main effect was through ingestion, which helps to explain why it was added to water, which you ingest. As Dr. Feierskov concluded, it is my professional opinion that the addition of fluoride to public water supplies is no longer justified from an oral health perspective. Now, I'm going to show you some of the admissions that the CDC gave us in this case on fluoride and teeth. Here's the first one.
So CDC recognizes and accepts that fluoride's predominant mechanism for preventing tooth decay comes from fluoride's topical contact with the outside of the enamel, correct?
Predominantly, that's where the benefits are, yes.
Okay, so as you can see, CDC agreed and admitted that fluoride's predominant effect on teeth is, for its predominant effect for the benefits, is topical, not systemic.
And then Featherstone writes, there is now overwhelming evidence that the primary caries preventive mechanisms of action of fluoride are post-eruptive through topical effects for both children and adults. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And the CDC agrees with that statement, correct?
Yes,
So
we do.
CDC agreed that the evidence is now, quote, overwhelming that the benefit is topical, okay, or the primary benefit is topical. So again, consistent with Dr. Feierskov's testimony that, at the very least, the predominant effect is topical. And there's debate about whether there's any benefit from ingestion at all, but if there is a benefit from ingestion, it's relatively minor in the overall scheme of things. Another admission that the CDC gave is that, is that there is no benefit from prenatal exposure. The CDC's representative admitted that they have no evidence to indicate that there's any benefit whatsoever to the baby from the mom being exposed to fluoride during pregnancy. And that's a significant admission in this case, because as the evidence clearly showed, the developing brain is more vulnerable than the adult brain, and particularly in the in utero period. So it's a period of life where you don't want to be exposing a baby to a neurotoxicant. And so the fact that fluoride presents no benefits during the in utero period is, I think, a significant fact for the overall risk-benefit analysis. And I should say here that the EPA did agree that fluoride passes through the placenta and gets into the fetal brain. So if a mom is drinking fluoride, exposed to fluoride, the baby will be exposed. And the blood-brain barrier is not well developed in the in utero period or in early infancy, and the fluoride that gets to the baby does have access to the brain.
So
a third admission the CDC gave is that they have no evidence to indicate that there's any benefits from drinking fluoridated water during the first 6 months of life at all. And that's a significant admission, because a bottle-fed baby who's fed formula made with fluoridated water has a very high exposure to fluoride. In fact, it's the highest exposure by body weight of all age groups in the population. And that flips on its head what's the sort of the natural situation. A breastfed baby receives virtually no fluoride and is the lowest exposed age group in the population to fluoride. But when you bottle feed the baby with formula made with fluoridated water, that baby becomes the highest exposed age group in the population at a period of time where the EPA agrees is a, quote, critical window of development. It's a very important period of time for brain development. You don't want to be exposing a newborn to a neurotoxicant. And so here's what the CDC representative stated about the benefits of water fluoridation for the first 6 months, during the first 6 months of life.
Is the CDC aware of any evidence demonstrating benefits from consumption of fluoridated drinking water during the first 6 months of life?
We are not aware of any evidence.
Okay.
That's after about 80 years of water fluoridation. The CDC admitted we have no evidence that it's actually beneficial for infants. And that is in the context of just millions upon millions of kids having been fed formula made with fluoridated water. And there was never a benefit to justify the risk that comes with that. And I think it's something that really needs to be taken into account when we're talking about this water fluoridation program. And I think, as we think about the chemicals we're adding to water, should we be mindful of those families that need to use formula and bottle feed their kids? Should that water be safe for them to use or not? Okay, so let's move on. That was some of what we addressed in discovery, and now I want to talk about trial in this case. And I'm happy to say that this case is the first time a citizen group has ever taken a citizen petition under TSCA all the way to a trial. That has never been done before in the 40 plus years of this statute. So I was happy that we were able to be the first. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the experts that we put on the stand. I was, honored to be able to call Dr. Howard Hu has been funded by the NIH for decades to understand and research how environmental chemicals affect human health. And Dr. Hu has been studying the impact of fluoride on IQ, and he's been doing that in a birth cohort down in Mexico City. And in that cohort, Dr. Hu was able to measure the level of fluoride in the urine of the pregnant moms, and then was able to measure the IQ of the children at ages 4, 6, and 12, and also control for all the other sort of factors you look to when studying IQ, like parental education, the quality of the home environment, exposures to other toxic compounds, age of gestational age, things like that. He was able to control for all those other factors so as to not just look at fluoride and IQ. And his study, which again was funded by the NIH, found that prenatal fluoride exposure was significantly correlated with reductions in IQ, that the higher the exposure of the mom, the lower the IQ of the child. And the levels of exposure in this case were not high. They were actually so-called optimal exposures, because the major exposure in this cohort to fluoride was salt fluoridation. And salt fluoridation is designed to do the same thing that water fluoridation is designed to do, to supplement a person's diet with fluoride at the so-called optimal level. So in his study funded by the NIH, Dr. Hu found that prenatal fluoride exposure was associated with drops in IQ. We also called Dr. Bruce Lanphier as one of our experts. Dr. Lanphier, who was one of the scientists, he's published some of the seminal research on low-level lead and IQ. Dr. Lanphier's research on lead has been relied upon by government agencies around the world, including the EPA, to protect the public from lead. And now Dr. Lanphier has been studying the impacts of fluoride on IQ, and he's been doing that with a birth cohort in Canada. And this cohort in Canada is in communities with and without water fluoridation. So the main source of fluoride is water fluoridation in that cohort. And Dr. Lanphier has used a similar design as Dr. Hu, controlling for a lot of key covariates. And Dr. Lanphier has found that, yes, in his cohort, prenatal fluoride exposure is associated with reductions in IQ of the children at age 4. He hasn't yet studied age 6 or 12. He's so far studied age 4. Now, he has found, epidemiology is usually a sort of, rarely do you have all studies saying finding the same thing. There's a lot of noise in epidemiology generally. So Dr. Lanphier found that when looking at maternal urine, there was a clear reduction in IQ for the boys, but not the girls. He did not find a significant effect on girls with the maternal urine as the measure of exposure. And there's been various, theories advanced for why that might be the case. One of them is that there can be sex-specific differences in how neurotoxicants can affect development. And we do know that boys in North America are suffering neurodevelopmental disorders at higher rates than girls. But that does remain to be elucidated, why the effect in the Canadian cohort seemed to be sex-specific when using maternal urine as the exposure, whereas in Mexico, they did not see that sex difference for that metric of exposure. But we were thrilled to be able to call Dr. Lanphier, who explained his findings to the court. EPA at trial, the trial, I should say, was in June of 2020. And EPA agreed that Dr. Hu's and Dr. Lanphier's studies are, quote, the most methodologically reliable human studies to date on the impact of fluoride on neurodevelopment. So EPA understood that these were high quality epidemiological studies. So their findings were significant. We also had I had the honor of being able to call Dr. Philippe Grandjean as one of our experts. Dr. Grandjean is an internationally renowned environmental epidemiologist, and he has reviewed the full body of literature on fluoride in the brain, and he concluded that the weight of epidemiological evidence leaves no reasonable doubt that developmental neurotoxicity is a serious human health risk associated with elevated fluoride exposure, including those occurring at the levels added to drinking water in fluoridated areas. And we call Dr. Kathleen Thiessen, who's a risk assessment scientist who has written about fluoride for the EPA in the past. Dr. Thiessen was a panelist on the NRC's 2006 report. And in this case, Dr. Thiessen applied EPA's risk assessment framework to fluoride and concluded that using EPA's procedures leads to the inevitable conclusion that water fluoridation poses an unreasonable risk to human health. Now, at the first trial that we had, EPA called the experts that it called were from Exponent, which some of you may be familiar with. It's an industry-funded consulting group that has basically vouched for the safety of many industry products, including pesticides, and you name it. I mean, basically, they're a go-to consulting firm for the Fortune 500, corporate America. And it was interesting that EPA would rely on Exponent to defend the safety of water fluoridation and not its own scientist. EPA did call a scientist from its staff to testify in the case, but she did not do her own research on fluoride, and she instead relied upon Exponent's reviews to reach her conclusions. Now, one of the things that came through in our trial in June of 2020, which I was very happy about, is that EPA admitted it used the wrong standard. And here is a part of my examination, my cross-examination of EPA's expert, Tala Henry, at trial. I said, you held plaintiffs to a burden of proof the EPA has not held a single chemical under Section 6 before. Section 6 is TSCA, correct? And she answered, by the words on the page, I guess that's true. So she admitted that they were holding us to a burden of proof that they do not hold other chemicals to. And this brings us back to that point earlier where EPA is not using its risk assessment procedures with fluoride. It's holding fluoride to a higher standard, a double standard. And that came through at our trial. And the judge picked up on that, saying at the end of our first trial that the EPA appears to have applied a standard of causation, which from my read of TSCA is not accurate. It's not a proper application. It's not the proper standard. So the court recognized that EPA was not using its normal risk assessment procedures for fluoride, and that was a problem. The court also expressed concern about the evidence that we had presented about fluoride's neurotoxic effects, stating at the end of our trial, there is serious evidence here. There is no doubt that these two studies from Canada and Mexico raise serious questions. So at this point, this statement here that you see on your screen was made by the judge after I had finished closing argument and EPA had finished closing argument. And I was feeling good at this point that we may be on the verge of getting a favorable opinion of the court finding that fluoridation poses a risk. But the court chose to put the case on hold, what's called a stay. And the main reason for why the court wanted to put the case on hold was because the court was aware that the National Toxicology Program, which is this expert body at the Department of Health and Human Services, the federal government, was conducting a systematic review on the effects of fluoride on IQ. And that is the issue that was really the focus of our case. And reasonably so, although it was frustrating for me because as an attorney in the case, I was hoping we would get a verdict and, be able to, to win. I was hoping for a verdict now, but the judge wanted to wait and be able to get the benefit of this expert body's findings at the federal governmental level. And I can certainly understand the judge wanting that, to have that before making a decision in this case, because this is a significant decision. The federal court is needing to determine whether water fluoridation presents a risk to the brain. And naturally, the judge wanted to consider what the experts at the federal government had to say. So the case goes into a stay. So we waited for the NTP and waited and waited some more. And then 2 years later, 2 years after our trial in the summer of 2020, so now in 2022, I am approached by a person with knowledge about what was happening at the NTP. And she told me that the report that we had all been waiting for had been done. It was complete. But that the NTP had been prohibited from releasing it. And more troubling than that is she said, that report that you've been waiting for may never be released. And so when I learned that, I immediately go to the judge, because here we are with our entire case on hold, waiting for this government report. And now I've been told that this government report was actually finished and may never be released. So if it's never released, our case never resumes, and we basically are, by default, our case is over. So I went to the judge, and in the same process, I began doing Freedom of Information Act requests to understand with greater detail what was going on. Why was the NTP prohibited from publishing this report? And so here I'm going to show you some of what we found. And I might have a time constraint here, so I'll probably speed up on this, but I'll just make a long story short. And that is, the documents show that we very clearly that the CDC, as well as other dental interests at the Department of Health and Human Services, intervened and blocked the NTP from publishing this report. And it was ultimately the Assistant Secretary for Health, Rachel Levine, who, at the request of CDC, at the request of the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research, Rachel Levine blocked the NTP from releasing the report. As you can see here in an email from a CDC scientist, quote, "The latest we heard yesterday is that Assistant Secretary of Health Levine has put the report on hold until further notice." Now, this pushback by CDC and these other dental sort of officials caused a lot of consternation at NTP. Here is a statement, an email from Brian Berridge, who is the scientific director of NTP, saying, "After 17 years in industry, I've seen efforts to modify messages to fit commercial interests. I wasn't party to that there, and I'm not game to do that here." So Dr. Berridge was very concerned about the pressure being placed on NTP. But I'm happy to say that after raising these issues with the court lifted the stay, and we went back to trial. So a second trial, and that occurred early last year in 2024. And at this trial, we had the benefit of getting a copy of the buried National Toxicology Program report. We were able to get a copy through discovery of that report that was supposed to be the final report, but which had been blocked. And all the experts in the case, our experts and EPA's experts, were able to read it and comment on the findings and the implications of the findings, as well as other new evidence. So I'll start here by talking about, some of what the National Toxicology Program found in its assessment. First, the NTP found that there is a large body of evidence on IQ effects in children. NTP identified 72 studies on fluoride and IQ in human populations, which is a large body of data. The NTP found that the associations between higher fluoride exposure and lower children's IQ are consistent in the vast majority of studies of both low and high quality. The NTP found that, in summary, the high quality studies, i.e. studies with low potential for bias, consistently demonstrate lower IQ scores with higher fluoride exposure. Now, as you can see in this slide, the NTP's confidence in the association between fluoride and reduced IQ was couched at the 1.5 parts per million fluoride in water level. That's, that level and above is where NTP had its most confidence that there's this adverse association. NTP didn't say there's no association below 1.5, just that it was less clear to the NTP what the what that association was below 1.5. But at 1.5 and above, NTP had, as it to use its terms, moderate confidence that fluoride is linked to low IQ. NTP found that confounding is not a concern, which is important because you always want to rule out confounding when you're looking at epidemiological data. And the NTP was confident that confounding is not biasing these results in some kind of artifactual way. And NTP found that a spurious association is unlikely. And importantly as well, NTP noted that in fluoridated communities, there's a significant number of people, including pregnant women, who have urinary fluoride levels that are at and above the levels that you see in these higher fluoride communities, the communities with 1.5 parts per million and above. So there's an overlap of exposure. And that just makes common sense because we know that people drink very different amounts of water. There's some people drink, 4 liters of water a day. Some people drink less than 1 liter. So you have a wide range of water consumption. But for those people who drink a lot of water, they're going to get as much fluoride as people who drink ordinary amounts of water in higher fluoride communities. And also, we are exposed to fluoride through many other sources, like dental products and processed foods and beverages and some pesticides and some pharmaceuticals. And so there's going to be some individuals in fluoridated communities who have the levels of fluoride in their body that the NTP has confidence are neurotoxic. Okay. So that was a significant, finding and, fact in our second trial. And during the trial, there was a surprise development because there was a paper published by Risk Sciences International. And Risk Sciences International is based in Canada, and they had done a systematic review, just like NTP had, of the relationship between fluoride and IQ. And they had done this review on behalf of Health Canada. And Risk Sciences International's conclusions were very similar to the NTP's. And here's what they found. Quote, the overall evidence identified to date strongly suggests that fluoride can affect cognitive outcomes in children, specifically reduction in IQ scores, at levels close to those currently seen in North American drinking water. And that was a very unexpected report to come out right in the midst of our trial. And the judge did allow this report to go into evidence, and the experts were able to comment on this report. But it very much supported and buttressed the NTP's assessment. So I want to now, as we're getting to the end here, I want to talk about what I saw as the 2 key admissions by the EPA, and then the key dispute in the case, and then I'll conclude with the court's conclusion. I think we probably have about 10 minutes left, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. So I'll talk about what I see as the 2 key admissions at trial. The first is that neurotoxicity is indeed a hazard of fluoride exposure. Now, I know we talked about this at the beginning of the day, beginning of my presentation. And I'll show you some of the testimony here on this point. This is Jesus Ibar Luzuea, who is who was one of EPA's experts at the second trial. And here's what he said.
Do you agree that at least at high doses, epidemiological evidence is consistent in showing an association between fluoride and adverse neurodevelopmental effects?
Definitely.
Given the findings from the high-dose epidemiological literature, do you agree that at least at high doses, fluoride is a neurotoxic?
I would say yes.
So there you have one of EPA's experts saying, yeah, definitely the evidence is consistent in finding that higher levels of exposure to fluoride are linked to lower IQ, and agreeing that at least at higher levels of exposure, fluoride is a neurotoxicant. Okay, so that's again one of EPA's experts. And here is Dr. Stanley Barone, who was probably the most important witness at trial in the second trial. And in contrast to the first trial from June of 2020, when EPA really relied on exponent, okay, in the second trial, EPA relied a lot on Dr. Barone, so its own real expert in-house, okay? And Dr. Barone is not only a neurotoxicologist by training, but he's also a true risk assessment professional. He has been involved with all of EPA's risk evaluations under TSCA since 2016, which was when this statute was amended. And so he's intimately familiar with EPA's risk assessment procedures. And in this clip, what I was doing here is I wanted to see if Dr. Barone would agree that the evidence on fluoride neurotoxicity meets EPA's standard for hazard ID for a neurotoxicant. Hazard ID means the chemical is a neurotoxicant, okay? And I wanted to see if we now had, so let me back up. Under EPA's sort of approach, you can establish that a chemical is a neurotoxicant if you have, quote, sufficient human evidence. You can separately establish it based on animal data. But here I was asking Dr. Barone, do you agree that we now have sufficient human evidence that fluoride is a neurotoxicant? And here is the testimony on that point.
You would certainly agree that based on NTP's assessment of the literature as of April 2021, that there was sufficient human evidence of a neurotoxicity hazard as defined under the EPA guidelines.
Again, associating fluoride exposure from multiple routes and multiple sources, there's an association. But again, relating that back to drinking water alone, most of the studies are looking at total fluoride. They're not looking specifically at fluoride from drinking water.
Okay, but in terms of total fluoride exposure, you would agree that the literature that NTP reviewed up through April 2021 meets EPA's sufficient human evidence standard under the guidelines.
For hazard ID.
Okay. You agree with that?
I would agree that there's significant evidence there for a sufficiency call.
Right. And you agree that it meets the sufficient human evidence standard?
It meets the sufficient evidence standard.
So it took a while to get there, but I really wanted to sort of, make it very clear to leave no room for ambiguity. But he agreed there that yes, there is sufficient human evidence to establish that fluoride is a neurotoxicant under EPA's neurotoxicity risk assessment guidelines, and that was a significant admission. So again, we're not at trial. There was no dispute: is fluoride a neurotoxicant? We'll get to what the key disputes were, but EPA accepted that, yeah, at a certain level of exposure, fluoride is going to damage the brain.
You would certainly.
And so let's talk about the second key admission. And that is that Dr. Barone agreed that you do need a margin of safety for fluoride neurotoxicity. And that's something that the EPA has resisted for so long. Because again, if you start implementing margins of safety with fluoride, you quickly get to a dose that's far below what millions of people are ingesting every day because of water fluoridation. There's no room for a margin of safety with fluoride. And that's, highlights how risky and dangerous this practice is. But Dr. Barone admitted in this case that yes, you need a margin of safety of at least 10 to protect the population from neurotoxicity. Okay. Now, here's the clip. I just want to preface this by saying that EPA uses a rather technical, wonky term for margin of safety in its risk assessments under TSCA. It uses the term benchmark margin of exposure, or benchmark MOE. And that's the term that I'm using when I'm asking Dr. Barone here. But just know that from a sort of lay perspective, it effectively means margin of safety.
Did you give any consideration as to what an appropriate benchmark MOE should be for fluoride neurotoxicity?
Yeah, I did. Given that the critical studies in question are probably epidemiological studies, human studies, uncertainty factor of 10, which is appropriate for all life stages, inclusive of all life stages and vulnerabilities at face value, would be the benchmark MOE.
Okay.
So a benchmark MOE of 10, okay, margin of safety of 10. So if you just apply that, let's go back to the NTP's report. And the NTP found with moderate confidence that 1.5 parts per million in the water and above is consistently associated with reductions in IQ. Well, take 1.5 and divide it by 10. That's the application of the margin of safety, or the safety factor. That brings you to a level of 0.15 parts per million fluoride. 0.15. How does that compare to what we are adding to drinking water for fluoridation? Well, that level